Hello everyone, welcome to this third lecture in our series on political science, Unit 3. This lecture is going to be about terrorism and, more importantly, our responses to terrorism. And we're going to try to answer a couple of questions, and I want to preface this by saying that I recognize that this is a sensitive topic for quite a few of you, especially for those of us that live here, this close to New York City. If you have any issues or any questions about the content of this lecture, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to work with you on that, and I'm sure we can figure something out separately. As part of this lecture, we're going to try to answer a couple of things. What is terrorism? Why do people engage in terrorism? And what have been the policy and cultural responses to terrorism? And if we are able to understand these questions, we can sort of understand roughly how to create a policy response for anti-terrorism. So let's start with the basics. What's terrorism? Well, terrorism is the use of indiscriminate force against traditional and or, importantly, civilian targets for the purpose of achieving a particular goal. The idea is what kind of targets, traditional or military or civilian, can we target in order to achieve our political goal? And usually that goal is to create political and cultural terror in the promotion of a goal, agenda, or political ideology. Now, the birth of modern terrorism, though we understand terrorism to work, actually happens with the troubles between England and Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s. It does not usually, it does not really occur the way we understand terrorism to be in certain regions of the world. It actually happens in the UK. It starts there. And what are the aims and the goals here? Well, it's to cause damage to property and crucial infrastructure, economic structures, or political institutions. Create as much damage as possible. But also tries to create what's called a mental hijacking of the national discourse. Because for however many days, weeks, months, or even a year after the attack, people will be discussing the organization that committed the attack, their aims, and their goals. And so there's this idea of making a splash, which the goal is, hopefully, quote unquote, to create an environment where people say, give them what they want, and so they will stop doing this. The idea is to promote fear and thus irrational decision making by the public and by lawmakers, because that irrational decision making will lead to increase in converts, because people engage in overreactions to terrorism, or because it will lead to overreaching policies that then the terrorist organization can critique their enemies for. Now, we would be remiss in a class on terrorism to not discuss the centerpiece document for this lecture, the 9/11 Commission Report, and so a brief history of 9/11. Let's try to understand what happened and why it happened. In order to do so, we have to bounce to Montgomery Meig's reading for today, in which he talks about the use of asymmetric and idiosyncratic uses of weaponry. Al-Qaeda's attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon provides the most recent and spectacular example of this. Because if one thinks of a modern passenger plane in terms of its explosive and incendiary potential, you basically have a guided missile of devastating effect. The problem with terrorism is that they are able to use weapons idiosyncratically. The idea that terrorists are able to use non-traditional weapons in non-traditional ways. They're able to create weapons that military counterparts cannot even dream up and or hope to counter, and then use those weapons in non-traditional ways. Now, there were 4 planes on 9/11 that were hijacked, 2 of which, as you probably know, crashed into the World Trade Center towers. 1 crashed into the Pentagon, and a last one, which was believed to be en route towards the White House, crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, on its way to Washington, D.C. You have here a minute-by-minute breakdown of the flight path of these planes, and I highly recommend, even if it goes beyond the scope of this class, really reading the 9/11 Commission report, because it is illuminating on how such an attack was carried out and why our response politically has been what it has been. So, 4 questions about 9/11, I suppose, is worth bringing up. Who was Osama bin Laden exactly? Who did his ideology appeal to and why? What flaws in our system does his brand of terrorism exploit? And then what lessons can we draw from our reaction? Well, as a young man, bin Laden entered Afghanistan in the initial conflict against the Soviet Union. Between 1979 and 1989, Osama bin Laden and his Islamist organization, which had yet to become Al-Qaeda the way we understand it to be, was fighting a proxy war against the new communist government of Afghanistan. In fact, the Commission report says that a decade of conflict in Afghanistan between 79 and 89 gave Islamist extremists a rallying point and a training field. The communist government in Afghanistan gained power in 1978, but was unable to establish enduring control. And at the end of 1979, the Soviet government sent in military units to ensure the country would remain under Moscow's influence. The response was an Afghan national resistance movement that defeated the Soviet forces. And importantly, young Muslims from around the world flocked to Afghanistan to join as volunteers in what was seen as a holy war, jihad, against an invader. The largest numbers came from the Middle East, some were Saudis, and amongst them was Osama bin Laden. Very famously, Osama bin Laden was profiled in Western media as a pro-Western fighter, as someone who was willing to fight the Soviets in favor of a free Afghanistan. Who was this guy? Well, he was 23 when he arrived in Afghanistan in 1980. Bin Laden was the 17th of 57 children of a Saudi construction magnate. He had attended Abdulaziz University in Saudi Arabia. By some accounts, he had been interested there in religious studies, inspired by tape recordings of the fiery sermons of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian and a disciple of Qutb. Bin Laden was conspicuous among the volunteers, not because he showed evidence of religious learning, but because he had access to some of his family's huge fortune. Although he took part in at least one battle, he became chiefly known as a person who generously helped fund the anti-Soviet jihad. And it's important to understand that bin Laden's money and his influence were essentially tools through which he was able to purchase his way to the top of this Islamist organization. However, he understood better than most of the volunteers the extent to which the continuation and the eventual success in Afghanistan depended on an increasingly complex and almost worldwide organization. This organization included a global financial support network that became known as the Golden Chain, put together mainly by financiers in Saudi Arabia and Persian Gulf states. Donations flowed through charities and other non-governmental organizations. Bin Laden and the Afghan Arabs drew largely on funds raised by this network, whose agents roamed world markets to buy arms and supplies for the Mujahideen, or the Holy Warriors. Essentially, what bin Laden does is that he modernizes and brings jihad into the 21st century. Now, while we ended up not doing the class on asymmetric warfare, it's important as a refresher from our classes in Unit 2 when we talk about sub-state actors in the 21st century. These actors that states have tremendous difficulty in defeating. Sub-state actors are internationalized, stateless, and networked. And bin Laden applies all three of these concepts to the model of terrorism that he creates all the way back in the 1980s. The organization that he creates, Al-Qaeda, its members recognize no borders, identify with the cause over their own national identity, and they have a global network of operatives. But who are these operatives? Who does Osama bin Laden's ideology appeal to, and why? Well, in order to answer this question, we actually need to sort of divide this into two questions, which is, why does bin Laden believe what he does? And why do these ideas become so popular? Well, despite his claims to universal leadership, bin Laden offers an extreme view of Islamic history, designed to appeal mainly to Arabs and Sunnis. He draws on fundamentalists who blame the eventual destruction of the caliphate on leaders who had abandoned the pure path of religious devotion. And this is important. Bin Laden's viewpoints did not represent mainstream religious thought in the Islamic world. However, he fabricates this view of Islamic history in which, in order for Islamism to succeed, the righteous path needed to be followed again. And so for those yearning for a lost sense of order in an older, more tranquil world, bin Laden offers his caliphate as an imagined alternative to today's uncertainty. Because especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the world became filled with uncertainty. And for others, he offers simplistic conspiracies to explain their world. If you are poor, if you are dispossessed, if you are disenfranchised, bin Laden had a reason for that. He had an explanation for that. And not everyone needed to believe it, but enough did for this to become an issue. Bin Laden relied heavily on the Egyptian writer Sayyid Qutb, who mixed Islamic scholarship with a very superficial acquaintance with Western history and thought. He was sent by the Egyptian government to study in the United States in the 1940s, but when he returned, he had an enormous loathing of Western society and history. He dismissed Western achievements as entirely material, arguing that Western society possesses nothing that will satisfy its own conscience or justify its existence. And bin Laden from Qutb draws this idea that the new enemy, the enemy for the post-Soviet era, needed to be the United States. And the 9/11 Commission report argues that bin Laden shared Qutb's view, permitting him and his followers to rationalize even unprovoked mass murder as a righteous defense of an embattled faith. Many Americans have wondered, why do, quote, they, end quote, hate us? Some also ask, what can we do to stop these attacks? Well, bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have given answers to both of these questions. To the first, they say, well, America had attacked Islam first. America is responsible for all conflicts involving Muslims. And thus Americans are blamed when Israelis fight with Palestinians, when Russians fight with Chechens, when Indians fight with Kashmiri Muslims, and when the Philippine government fights ethnic Muslims in its southern islands. America is also held responsible for the governments of these Muslim countries, which are derided by Al-Qaeda as your agents. Bin Laden stated flatly, our fight against these governments is not separate from our fight against you. And so, these charges found a ready audience among millions of Arabs and Muslims angry at the United States because of issues ranging from Iraq to Palestine to America's support for their own country's repressive rulers all through the Cold War. Bin Laden's grievance with the United States may have started in reaction to specific U.S. policies, but it quickly became far deeper. To the second question, what America could do, Al-Qaeda's answer was that America should abandon the Middle East, convert to Islam, and end the immorality and godlessness of its society and culture. And so let's synthesize this into two main points. Bin Laden believed that all violence against Muslims anywhere, regardless of their country, is the fault of the United States. And he believes that American society and culture is inherently immoral and godless. Okay. Bin Laden was not the first person to believe these things, though. So why did these ideas gain so much traction when they did? Well, among Arabs, Bin Laden's followers are commonly referred to as takfiri, or those who define other Muslims as unbelievers, because of their readiness to demonize and murder all of those with whom they disagree. Beyond the theology lies the simple human fact that Muslims, like most other human beings, are repelled by mass murder and barbarism, whatever their justification. And this is important because this brand of terrorism, therefore, does not seek to attract a sort of broad consensus. It's not looking to be Mr. Popular. Instead, the model of terrorism that Al-Qaeda creates in the late 20th to 21st century is searching for a particular kind of person. And so, by the 1990s, the high birth rates and declining rates of infant mortality had created a common problem throughout the Muslim world. A large, steadily increasing population of young men without reasonable expectation of suitable or steady employment, a sure prescription for social turbulence, and therefore frustrated in their search for a decent living, unable to benefit from an education that was often obtained at the cost of great family sacrifice, and blocked from starting families of their own. Some of these young men were easy targets for radicalization. As political, social, and economic problems created flammable societies, Bin Laden used Islam's most extreme fundamentalist traditions as his match. And all of these elements combined, including religion, in an explosive compound. Essentially, Bin Laden is searching for someone who, in terrorist circles, has been often described as no job, no girlfriend, no prospects. Other extremists had and have followings of their own, but in appealing to societies full of discontent, Bin Laden remained credible as other leaders and symbols failed. He could stand as a symbol of resistance, above all, resistance to the West and to America. He could present himself and his allies as victorious warriors in the one great successful experience for Islamic militancy in the 1980s, the Afghan jihad against the Soviet occupation. And finally, Bin Laden had another advantage: his substantial worldwide organization. By the time he issued his February 1998 declaration of war, Bin Laden had nurtured that organization for nearly 10 years. He could attract, train, and use recruits for ever more ambitious attacks, rallying adherents with each demonstration that his was the movement of the future. And so why were certain people receptive to these ideas? Because low economic prospects and poor social mobility created a generation of disaffected young men that were born in the 1990s. And that Bin Laden personally was uniquely placed to be the figurehead of all anti-American sentiment that these young men might have had. The four of these ideas combined into the compound that was Al-Qaeda's operations through the 90s and through the early 2000s. So, what flaws in our system does his brand of terrorism exploit? Well, as I mentioned before briefly, terrorists have infinite possibilities and choices. while counterterrorism forces are dominated by their rules and by their bureaucracies. What I mean to say is, terrorist organizations, especially in the bin Laden mold, can behave in such an out-of-the-box manner that it becomes fundamentally difficult, if not impossible, to counteract, especially as these methods have evolved for the 21st century in an era of social media and the internet. As these methods have evolved, it has become increasingly difficult to stop these idiosyncratic and asymmetric choices. In a word, terrorists have infinite targets that they can target in infinite ways because they do not recognize the boundary between military and civilian targets. Traditional forces, police, army, FBI, counter-terrorist organizations, have to play by the rules that we have given them. Now, of course, this should not be taken to mean that we should remove the rules from these institutions. But if you ask why the terrorists have an advantage in this regard, this is it. The terrorists do not play by our rules, and because they do not, it is infinitely more difficult to stop such an organization, especially in the mold that bin Laden created. Now, the last question is the question that I wanted to leave off for today, which is the lessons. What lessons can we draw from our reaction to terrorism? What is the moral of the story here? And I want you to really think about this again beyond the scope of this class and going into your finals, because it's really important that you try to understand what motivated these disaffected young men to join Al-Qaeda and engage in the sort of activity that they did, and what sort of social remedies can be put in place to prevent this sort of thing. And on that note, I think I'm going to end this here. I'll see you guys for our last lecture on North Korea. Stay tuned.